In this demo, I'll be working with Subnet public IP addressing. Now we're going to go ahead and start by taking a look at the VPC console. So here in the main console, I'll click on VPC because I've recently visited that. And if I go into the Your VPCs view, I can look at the properties of an existing VPC. And from here, there is a reference to the IPv4 CIDR blocks if more than one was enabled for the VPC. Now, of course, any subnets within that VPC would have to have their CIDR blocks within the VPC CIDR block. So, of course, when we go into subnets and when we click on a given subnet, we'll have the IPv4 CIDR for it, which, of course, must be within its VPC's CIDR block address range. But those are private IP addresses. If I go into the EC2, if I were to go into the EC2 management console and take a look at any of my instances, let's pick on a running one, it's got a private IP address. So that allows communication within the VPC with multiple resources or even between VPCs if you've enabled VPC peering. And you can opt to either enable a public IPv4 address or not with an EC2 instance. Now, the allocated public IPv4 address means it is publicly visible out on the internet. But the IP address can change between invocations of that instance if it's not always up and running. So, for example, currently it's 3.93.146.245. Let's copy that and let's just paste it here in WordPad so we don't forget it. Now, that virtual machine is currently running. I'm going to go ahead and stop the instance, and then we're going to start it again to see if the public IPv4 address changes. Okay, so I've restarted the same instance, and immediately we can notice it's got a different public IP address, which I'll copy, and I'll just paste here back in WordPad where we originally copied the original public IP address. So of course we can see that the public IP address has changed. Now that might be okay if all you need is for that instance to be able to get out to the internet, or you don't mind checking what its current public IP is if you need to remote into it to manage it. But what if that is an instance running some kind of custom app, whether it's a website or what have you, that needs to be accessible at all times? Well, in that case, you might want a static or unchanging IP address. And back here in the console, that's where, under Network and Security on the left, elastic IPs come into play. When you're in the EC2 management console, you can allocate elastic IP addresses and then associate them to instances, and then that way they would have a public IP, but it would never change. It's a static IP. But our focus is not elastic IPs. Our focus is how to enable or disable public IP addressing for subnets. So let's go back into the VPC console. I'll click Subnets over on the left, and I'm going to open up a subnet. Now, in the properties of a subnet, you get to determine whether or not it auto-assigns public IPv4 addresses when you deploy instances into the subnet. Here it's set to yes. I could go to the Actions menu here, and I could choose Edit Subnet Settings, and I could remove the check mark if I did not want to auto-assign public IPv4 addresses. Now let's take note of this subnet ID, subnet-E8B and so on. So E8B, let's keep that in mind. If I were to launch an EC2 instance into that subnet, so down under Network Settings, when I'm launching an instance, I'll click Edit, and I'll choose subnet E8B and whatnot. Notice that the auto-assign public IP option shows as being enabled for that selected subnet. Of course, we could override that at instance launch time, but what it does is it automatically is configured when you launch an instance unless you change it otherwise. So if you know that you don't want any of your instances to have public IPs assigned, maybe because you're going to VPN into AWS and then manage it using a private IP, then you could either disable it when you launch instances or just simply turn it off at the subnet level for that particular subnet. Okay, so let's go back to the VPC console. Let's change the auto IP address assignment for public IPs. Let's disable it basically for that subnet. So I'm going to go back into that subnet, into Actions, edit subnet settings, remove the check mark, but this time I'll scroll down and I'll click Save. So if I go back into the EC2 management console, and if I go to launch an instance in that same subnet, so I'll edit my network settings. It's the default VPC, the subnet again, of course, that has E8B in its name. Notice now the auto-assign public IP option is disabled. However, what's really interesting is that when you take a look at the public IP address for an instance, not the elastic IP, but the public IP assigned from the subnet as per what we're talking about. So let me just click once again on my Windows server. So we've got its public IPv4 address shown here in addition to its private IP. What I want to do is remote into this Windows virtual machine. I'll do that using its public IP. We're going to type ipconfig to see if these IP addresses, the public and the private, show up within the operating system. Okay, so now that I've signed into that virtual machine in the AWS cloud at the command prompt, if I were to type ipconfig, notice the only thing that gets returned is the private IP of the instance. So the public IP address is not known directly by the OS. It's external to this virtual machine. It's handled by Amazon Web Services, just like an elastic public IP address would be. So don't expect to see the public IP assigned to an instance in the OS when you view its network settings.